You're probably wondering, who is this Riaz Mohammed? Anybody know of him? Heard of him? I told you so. Hardly what you would call a household name. Now, you know that my feelings towards the radio and the news and all that kind of business, right? And I listen to the radio on the way to work. Don't listen to music or commercial radio, that's brain damage. So I usually listen to chat radio, but every time you switch on, it's Brexit this, Brexit that, Boris Johnson this, Boris Johnson that, Jeremy Corbyn this, and it just does my nutting, right? So I turn it off. So I get in Friday morning, turn the radio on, first thing, Brexit this, Brexit that, off. So I'm driving along the motorway and it's quiet in the car, so I decided to put the radio back on. And there was a voice of a man who'd begun to speak. I'd missed the very beginning. And he spoke with a calmness and an eloquence. And it pulled me into what he was saying. His name was Riaz Mohammed, that I learned later from the interview that he was given in BBC Radio Scotland. And he was born in Pakistan. And he was telling a story about his childhood. At the age of 5, he stood on the banks of one of the rivers there, while someone was struggling for a breath, drowning in the waters, a young lad. Nobody did anything. Eventually he was pulled out and laid on the banks, motionless. And Riaz stood there, wondering what was happening, wondering when someone would come to help. Eventually the young lad's mother and some of his aunts, I think, arrived, or other members of the family, and they just stood there and looked at the boy lying motionless on the bank. And other people gathered as well. And Riaz says that after a short time, or after a time, he wasn't sure how long it was, a gentleman arrived on a bike. He opened up a bag and he took out a thing which he said, I now know was a stethoscope. Put it to his ears and listened to the boy's chest and motioned, he's dead. And in that moment, the mother of the young lad was hysterical with grief, pulling her hair out, he said. I think the way he was talking, it happened literally. And the rest of the family were agonising over the death of the boy who just lay there. Nobody did anything. And Riaz, at the age of 5.5 years old, he says, this isn't right. I'm going to become a doctor so that I can help people in life. He wanted to become a doctor, amazing, isn't it? And so, I don't know exactly how many years later, but it was a short time later, he was still a young lad, and he came to Glasgow with his family, his parents and his brothers, and he went to school, primary school there. And he said it was horrendous. The kids made fun of him, they laughed at him, they joked about him, they called him names, they put him in the playground and ran circles around him and abused him. He says this went on and on and on. He says, I was terrified, it was upsetting, it was degrading. And the announcer says to him, well, what did your parents think about this? He says, I daren't tell them. They'd made a tremendous sacrifice to come here to give us a new life. I wasn't going to go and spoil that. He didn't say this, but he intimated this, that he says, I just sucked it up. I just decided to suck it up. And then he spoke a little bit being an immigrant, and I thought, oh, here we go. It's another one of these Brexit things about immigration and all that business that I reached for the radio, but reached for the off button, but then he started to speak again. He says, when I was in school, we did an English test, a grammar spelling kind of test. And we come back in, the teacher marked all the papers and says, who do you think to the class got the best mark? And all the hands were going up and shouting out all these names. And the teacher says, no, you're all wrong. She says, to my absolute astonishment, Riaz got the best mark in the class. And she gave him the paper back and she says, well done. Now keep going on. He says, the amount of encouragement that I felt in that moment was unbelievable. He said it was like a catalyst that just drove me forward and drove me on to attain the things that I wanted to attain, to achieve the things that I wanted to achieve. And then he says a little bit about encouraging people, and that's what we ought to be doing. So he graduated, I think, best in his class at primary, best in the class at secondary, and then he got to university to do through medical school. And then the best part of the story is life, well, the wee bit, he's actually written a book called What's Up, Docs. I might buy it, probably will buy that. So they're doing the rounds as a student doctor. You know, you said I had the white coat on and the crowd was walking by, all the patients in the hospital. The doctor was talking to them and stuff. And we came in this little room and the doctor says, well, that person doesn't have long to live there. She's going to die pretty soon. There's no much point in getting in there. And he says, and all the students filtered past. He said, but I didn't want to filter past. I wanted to go in. So Riaz went into the room and sat with the woman, took her hand and started just to talk to her. And he found that she says, doctor, I'm dying. He says, I'm not a doctor, I'm just a student. And she says, well, I'm dying and I'm afraid for my daughter. I've got a Down syndrome daughter. And I don't know what's going to happen to her. I don't know what to do. And Riaz says, there's nothing I can do for you. I can't help, but I know someone who can. And who do you think he mentioned? Jesus. I was absolutely astonished that this Pakistani man talked about Jesus. He says, I took her by the hand and prayed for her. I prayed to Jesus that she'd be comforted. And he says, the look in her face, the peace that passed over her face in that moment was greater than any drugs or any medical technique. He says, I'm not putting down medicine or drugs. He says, it's important. All of the morphine in the world couldn't have brought her that peace. And off he went. I thought that was wonderful. And then he talked about, the announcer says, oh, so what's this about your faith thing then? And he talked about how he met an art student who says, yeah, I'm a born-again Christian. And Riaz says, well, I didn't know what that was. That meant nothing to me. But then what I saw in the guy was how he walked with God. You know, how he lived his life with God at the heart of his life. He says, and that impressed me. He says, I was brought up a Muslim. My brothers still are Muslims. He says, but I wanted to know more about this Jesus guy. Became a Christian. Married a woman called Janet, and his 2 kids, and lives here to this day. Just a brilliant story. I thought, absolutely wonderful story. And then it made me think about this a little bit. And I wondered if anybody's ever felt like that, like he did when he first arrived to the country. In a situation where you feel boxed in, where you have the feeling that you have nowhere to go, because your enemy is circling around you, a powerful and threatening enemy, terrifying the life out of you, having you hemmed in to the point where you don't have anywhere really to go. Going forward with his plan was fraught with risk and sacrifice and fear. Possibly going forward would have more fear and more pain in the initial phase than going back ever would. So the way back perhaps seemed easier at the time. We know people, in fact, who have faced and are facing great challenges. And we know people like that who have says, well, I've had enough of this. I've had enough. I can't do it anymore. I'm just going to give up. And they roll over, and the challenge is no longer, and they're done. If you're reading a book, you know, whether this happens in real life or even fiction, if you're reading a book or you're watching a movie where the main protagonist rolls over and gives up, that's extremely, you go, what? It's a bit of a shock. It's extremely discouraging. It's deflating. Imagine the Rocky movies were all about Rocky giving up. You wouldn't get out to number 1. That'd have been the end of it. Perhaps Riaz was tempted to lie down. Perhaps he should have said, well, my place isn't here. Or at least if it is here, it's not to follow the dreams of grandeur that I have for myself as a doctor. Maybe I should just play ball with these people and know my place. I don't know if he was tempted with that, he didn't say. But I know what he did do, because he didn't lie down. And he pressed on towards his goal. So far in a series of lessons entitled Active Faith from Hebrews 11, we see the developing story of human history has been viewed through the lens of a relationship with God. We see how they lived out their faith, an active faith as we're calling it, which is a product of the relationship with God. We have seen the sacrifices that they have made in response to the call of God. They heard, they listened, they believed, and they acted, which is defined by their walk with God. And so to this week, we see not only an individual faith like Abel or Abraham or Moses, but we see a collective one. The people of Israel. And you know the story, and I overheard Derek talking about it this morning in the kids' class. I was trying to listen in. Joseph sold his brothers into slavery. His brothers didn't like him very much, did they? All this bragging and dreaming about how a big man he was going to be. So they didn't like that. But Joseph's dreams literally came true. He became the president of Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world. He was second in command, therefore the second most powerful man in the world. In that time, his homeland fell into famine, as you know, and he brought his brothers, after he, revealed himself. He brought his brothers and his father to live in the land of Egypt, welcomed by the Pharaoh and the people there. And they gave them a portion of the land. And they prospered, and their numbers started to grow greatly. And as time passed, Pharaoh passed, and a new Pharaoh came to power. And as time passed, the Pharaoh passed, and a new Pharaoh came to power. And as time passed, you get the picture. We move along through time. 400 and something years the people were there. And the latest Pharaoh, he'd forgotten all about Joseph. He'd forgotten all about the descendants of Joseph. He'd forgotten all about why they were there. He just saw how great the number was becoming and thought, in his mind only, that they were becoming a threat to him. What did Pharaoh do? He enslaved them. He oppressed them in the hope to suppress the threat that existed in his mind. Their life was no more than an existence. The people wouldn't even give them straw to make the bricks, and then punish them when they didn't make the bricks. At times, their lives would have been unbearable. The people cried out. Who heard their cries? Moses? Nah. Who heard their cries? God heard their cries. God heard them wailing from their oppressed state. And in Exodus chapter 3, Moses is out walking, sees a bush burning. Nothing unusual, but the fact is it wouldn't burn out, it just kept going. So I'm going to have to go over and have a look at this. And he goes over to the bush to investigate, and then the voice of God greets him. He says, I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of the land of Egypt to a good and broad land that flows with milk and honey. So Moses, go and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Pharaoh said no. Moses says no. He was too afraid. And there was a little bit of going backwards and forwards between him and God. And eventually he gives in and he goes to Pharaoh and he says to Pharaoh, the Lord my God is telling you now to let the people go. And Pharaoh says, no. Who is this Lord of yours that I should listen to him if he has anything to say? I'm not letting anyone go. Well, that was a rock upon which he would perish. 10 plagues later, darkness, blood, frogs, gnats, you name it, culminating in the death of the firstborn and of the Pharaoh himself, he decided, let the people go. Let the people go. It's estimated by commentators that around or over 2 million people left Egypt that day, and they left in haste. That's why we get the unleavened bread and all that business. They left the shackles of oppression behind. They were a free people, a blessed people, a people loved by God, a people who belonged to God, a people sheltered by God. He led the people out around Philistia. Is that right? Did I say that right? The Philistine land anyway, wherever it is. Didn't want the people to get into battles with them. Led them around Philistia, whatever it's called, through the wilderness on either side towards the banks of the Red Sea. The Egyptians weren't finished yet. And you could hear the charge of the fury of their chariots as they ran down the Egyptians to reclaim them once again. The people with nowhere to turn. They were boxed in. They were encircled by the enemy. The enemy was closing in from the rear. The wilderness lay at either side. There was no way through. Had they gone into the wilderness, it would have been certain death, either from the hostile land or easy pickings from the enemy. And to the fore, the vast barrier, the waters of the Red Sea. And what did the people do? Well, they do what they always did, what we always do when there's trouble. They complained. They cried out in complaint. They turned upon Moses, who had led them out, and in that moment they wished they hadn't left. They says to him, "You have just left us where we were. We told you that. Now we're coming here to have our graves in the desert." Hard labour and oppression seemed the better choice, given the circumstances. They couldn't see a way out. There was no way through the sea. There was no way through the wilderness. There was no way back. They were boxed in. But where there is no way, God finds a way, doesn't he? What's impossible with men is possible with God. On his instruction, Moses held out the staff towards the water, and the seas in front of him parted by the strong easterly wind, blowing the waters up into two great walls and leaving a chasm through which they could travel to their safety. A situation that seemed hopeless and lost, damning, was now hopeful. There was a way out. You might think they all just rushed in and, "Oh, look at this." I doubt that was the case. You imagine standing on the banks of the seas and they open up, and you're just going to walk through there? I don't think you would. I think you'd be like, "What's going on here?" Can't run into the wilderness, certain death. They faced their Riaz moment. Turn back and give up. They gave it their best shot. Perhaps it wasn't for them. These lofty grand thoughts of their own land. Not for us. We're smaller than that. So option one, turn back and beg for your lives to be spared that they might go back to hard labour. And then there's option two. There's always an option two with God. It's to rise to the challenge. Rise to the challenge. "Oh, but the children are making fun of my colour." Rise to the challenge. "Oh, but they encircle me and they threaten me." Rise to the challenge. "But I can't speak the language." Rise to the challenge. "But it was all terrifying and horrible." Rise to the challenge. Rise to the challenge. Walking through the waters of the Red Sea, though pushed aside into two walls, was hardly a cinch. As I says, put yourself in that position. Stand on the bank of the sea. The waters are being held there as though invisible. You hear the howling, rushing wind coming from the east that apparently holding them there. It's darkness all around. You hear the rush and the clamour of the enemy behind. It's not an easy thing to walk into that. If it was an easy thing, the Holy Spirit would never have recorded their act as an act of faith in Hebrews 11:29. So they rose to the challenge. They rose to the challenge. 2 million people poured into the chasm left by the receding waters, crossing on, as the scripture says, dry land. I like that. That's kind of like God's assurance or reassurance that everything's going to be okay. Because if you've ever been to the beach or the coast or the shore or whatever, and you walk out when the sea's out, the sands can be really, really... People have died doing that, walking out too far, get trapped, and the tide comes back in and drowns them. But they're walking on dry land. It's just as though they were just leaving the sandy banks or the pebbly bank and walking on the same thing. I love that about God, this reassurance. Here's a way through, and by the way, there's a red carpet for you to walk through. Faith has been expertly explained week in and week out in this series of lessons. The faith that achieves great things. Think about the things that it's achieved in your life. Think about it. The things that you've done because of the faith that you have in God. Think about this. You're going to eternity. You are going to eternity. Your sins are forgiven you. Could you have managed that on your own? Could you walk into eternity on the last day and say, "Hi Jesus, I'm in because I did it all by myself, didn't need you"? Absolutely not. It's never going to happen. There's no one who'll stand and say that. The apostle listens to Jesus one day as he was speaking. And Jesus was talking about rich people and how difficult it would be for them to get into the kingdom of heaven. He says, you're better trying to get a camel through the eye of a needle as trying to get rich people into heaven. And the apostles were staggered. I mean, they were absolutely staggered by this. They were astonished. And he says, well, who then can get into the kingdom? How is it possible for anyone to get into the kingdom if that's the standard? And Jesus says, like he says on the banks of the sea, what's impossible with men is possible with God. He says all things are possible with God. Sometimes we lose sight of that, don't we? The winds howling around us from the east, although saving us, distract us, drown out the clarity of thought that we initially had when we left our shore on the journey through the parted sea. The walls on either side seeming posing and threatening, and we become afraid of where we are in the moment. We take our eyes from the leading pillar of fire, and we lose sight of the goal that we set out so proudly on. And then we start to question, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? What's the point in all of this? People make fun of us, we say. The PC Brigade threaten us. Our friends reject us. Our family don't respect us. We think, I have to do this. We think, I have to do that. I think we need to be there, or be here, or do this, or do that. And everything seems more important than the one thing is getting to the other side. The noise drowns out the focus and the point and the courage and the determination and the faith. Seen it many times. Christians who no longer have a measure of faith, or the measure of faith required. Not that God is looking at them, there's a barometer saying, right, okay, I'll save him because he's got enough. Not that. When I mean enough faith, I mean they don't have enough faith to cling, to hold on, to keep going on. They let themselves turn back and are therefore lost. They roll over, and the inrushing waters that capture the Egyptians capture them also, and they're swept away, lost forever. Seen it? How many times you've seen it? Heartbreaking. Heartbreaking. No one said that this, what we do here, was ever going to be easy. God never promised an easy passageway. Never did he promise an easy passageway. I mean, if you continue on from Hebrews 11:29 and a few other verses later, you see that it's not going to be easy. We read there that women received their dead by resurrection. So receive back their dead by resurrection. Their husbands were killed in battle, killed in service to God, and wouldn't see them again. Some of them were tortured. They says, I don't want to be released. Torture me more. If only for that name, torture me more. Others suffered, being mocked, scourged, thrown in jail, imprisoned, put in chains, stoned, sawn in two, killed and run through by the sword. They went about in skins of goats and sheep. They were destitute, afflicted, ill-treated. The world is not worthy of them. Wandering over deserts and mountains and dens and caves and holes in the ground. That was their existence. A faithful people. No one said it was going to be easy. Did they give up? Not the people in this paragraph, no. I'm sure there are others who did, people that we know as we've mentioned. Did they give up? No. Because their faith led them from the enemy, from oppression, to the shores of opportunity. And when the waters opened, the opportunity became greater. They knew there was a risk. They knew there was a sacrifice. And in they went anyway. To go to the other side to hear the song of Miriam. Safely on the other side. I'd love to have that kind of faith. Wouldn't that be amazing to have faith in that measure? Where somebody slaps you around the face for being a Christian, you go, do it again, that was good. If you're doing that for Jesus, again. Or you stand up in front of the PC brigade and say what you think because it says it in the scriptures, because it's the heart of God, and not care what comes your way. That would be really something. There's only one thing stops me from doing that, and that's me. And if I'm like that, I'm sure you are as well, or some of you are, or at least you have been, and if you've never been, perhaps you will be. It seems like sometimes we're just getting through, carried along by the rest in the crowd. And let me tell you this, there's nothing wrong with that. It would be nice to progress from that, of course, and work towards something more glorious in our faith. But getting through is all right. If that's all you have, God will take it and he'll hold on to you while you cling to the hem, and he'll pull you through. I remember a tennis player from the 70s, Jimmy Connors. You remember Jimmy Connors? I loved that guy. We didn't have wall-to-wall sports back in the day, of course. In the 70s, we had Wimbledon for 2 weeks on TV, and that was it. And I would tune in. I would find it when he was playing, I would tune in, rooted to the TV, watching this guy. Do you know what I loved about him? Was his absolute determination to win. I'd never seen it in anybody like I seen it in him. He would not give up. He was in situations where he was trailing. The match was gone, lost, and he still didn't give up. And in many of those situations, he came from easily losing margins and win matches. I was convinced that if he had to run over glass barefooted to play one more ball, he would have done it. I heard a YouTube interview with him a year ago or so in his present life, and he's had hip replacements and knee replacements and all that, but played till he was 39, got to the quarterfinals of the US Open at 39 years of age. Why? Because he just loved fighting and winning and being determined. There are Christians like that. They run over broken glass and think nothing of it to get one more ball back. Nothing phases them. They march through everything. Illness comes their way. Some kind of disappointment or discouragement comes their way. But they just soldier on. They shoulder out of the way and keep going. How do they do that? Oh, to be like that. They're an absolute marvel. But it's not like that for all of us. Life can be a grind. People toil through hardships and illness and suffering and pain. But we keep on going on, don't we? And why do we keep on going on? Because we look forward to the voice and the song of Miriam and the sea at the other side. Though the waters threaten, though the wind is biting, though the walls of water seem like they could defeat us at any time, though the darkness around us frightens us, we do not give up. We do not give up. Moses answered the people on the banks of the sea that day, don't be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. James says, blessed is the man who endures trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, the song of Miriam on the shore at the other side, that God has promised to those who love him. So we hang in. And if we can't hang in, we hang on. And if we can't hang on, we hang on to somebody else who can hang on to us. But we must not give up. We rise to the challenge, for our faith is achieving a great thing.